Okay, we're going to start on Chapter 12, the Chapter 12 quiz. Let me review real quick. I added to our rules. We already discussed the two terminological rules, and now we have the two quantitative rules. First one says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises. And number 4, the middle term must be distributed at least once. All right, so let's go to the quiz and let's review the first premise. All queens are good, all kings are good, therefore all kings are queens. Thank you. Getting some fresh tea there. All right, so let's talk about this. The first thing they wanted you to do was to identify the major term, major premise, minor premise. Okay, you should be experts at that by now. Major term is, of course, going to be the predicate of the conclusion. And remember, you got to be careful. Are they saying that kings equal queens here? Okay, now don't talk about whether it's correct or valid or not. Just is that what they're saying? Kings equals queens? Yes, that is what they're saying. So this is indeed the major premise. It's the predicate, and it's also up here. Therefore, we know this is the major premise. So you have answered 2 of the questions. Second thing they're wanting you to find is the minor premise. Minor premise is the subject of the conclusion, and we also see it here. So this is the minor term. I think I have the same premise. This is the minor term, therefore this is the minor premise. Pretty straightforward. Last one we need to identify. I wish I could do it in green, but I think my green marker is still dry. Let's check. Good. Good. That's the last one I have left. But let's talk about it for a second here. First of all, are they saying that kings equal good? Well, it does seem to be what they're saying, but look at this for a second. Good is not a noun. Really, a term needs to be a noun. And in this case, this is actually what you would call a predicate adjective. Kings are good. For it to be a term, it needs to be a noun. So what would the term be? There's an implied term here. That's not actually said, but it's implied. Let me erase this because this actually isn't my middle term. What's the implied word here? It's not that kings are good or queens are good. It's that kings are good. You can say people or things. Generally, we're just going to say things. So there is an implied word. I'll put in parentheses here. All kings are good things. All queens are good things. Things is a noun. Good is an adjective. So my middle term is not actually good. My middle term is actually good things. So that's my middle term. Okay, so we have our major and minor term and our middle term also, and we have our major and minor premise. The next thing they want you to address is whether or not this syllogism is valid or invalid. Okay, so we have 4 rules we need to check. We actually have 7, but at this point you've already learned 4, so we'll check it against these 4. Let's check against the terminological rules first. Rule number 1, there must be 3 and only 3 terms. We have 1, 2, and 3. Yes, these 2 are each taken as a pair. So rule number 1, check. Rule number 2, middle term must not occur in the conclusion. Our middle term is good things, and it is not in the conclusion, so yes, it passes rule 2. All right, let's move on. Rule 3, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premises. Okay, this takes a little bit more studying. Let's study this carefully. I'm going to erase this momentarily because I need the space over there. Okay, actually no, I'll do it down here. Okay, so we have queens, kings, and good things. I'm going to write them down here, and basically this is the way they had it written on your quiz. So that was your major term, your minor term, and your middle term. Now I'm going to make myself a little diagram over here. I have premise 1, premise 2, and the conclusion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my little chart here, I'm going to label whether or not they're distributed or undistributed. So let's take these one at a time. First of all, let's look at queens. In order for it to be distributed, it means that this term needs to apply to every queen that has ever existed, currently exists, or will ever exist. In other words, this is not referring to a specific subset, but the entirety of all things that are queen. Is that what it's saying up here? Well, it's saying all, so obviously that must be it. So yes, indeed, this word queen here is distributed in premise number 1. And we see the word queens show up down here also in the conclusion. So we'll come back in a minute and talk about whether that's distributed or not. Let's talk about the word kings. We see kings show up here in this premise. Again, it has the word all in front of it. So it's pretty easy to infer that yes, they mean distributed. By saying all, they mean every king that has ever existed, currently exists, or will ever exist. The full subset, all kings. So that is distributed. Now what we need to do is examine, let's see, we have this last word here. We'll talk about these in the premise. So we see good things show up in our two premises. Are they distributed or are they undistributed? To illustrate that, I'm going to draw a circle. So if this is the set of all things that are good, and what this first premise was saying is that all queens are good things. So the set of all things that are queens, I'll just put a capital Q for queens, are contained within this set of good things. But is it saying that all queens are all good things, or are there good things that are not queens? Well, there actually are good things that are not queens, such as chocolate, cats. Okay, maybe not cats, but chocolate. Yeah. So there are other things that are good things that are not the same as queens. Therefore, good things up here in this premise must not be distributed. It must be undistributed. It does not apply, the usage up here does not apply to every example of good things. So in premise number 1, good things is undistributed. Now, similarly, I could argue about premise number 2. Again, kings is a subset of good things, but doesn't equal every good thing that ever exists. So once again, this term here, good things, is talking about a subset. It is not distributed to everything in that set. It is a subset, so it's undistributed. Now we haven't talked about kings and queens down here. So let's come and look at that. Let's look at kings first. So where kings occurs in the conclusion, it has the word all in front of it. When the word all is in front of it, it always makes it very easy. That obviously means all kings, everything that has ever been king or ever will be. So in the conclusion, kings is definitely distributed. Well, what about the word queens? Well, if I were to come back to my little diagram here, the diagram still is the same. This would be queens, and what this conclusion is saying here is that all the kings are queens. But are they saying that all kings are every queen? It's saying that kings is a subset of the ultimate set of queen. Is there something that's queen outside of king? Okay, it seems weird to even be saying that, but we have a cat that thinks she's a queen, so yes, there could be things that are queens that are other than kings. So what is that saying here? It's saying that this use of queens in this conclusion statement here is undistributed. Whoops, where'd I put it? Right there. Is undistributed. All right, so I've gone through for each of these terms now, each time they occur, and I've kind of diagrammed whether they are distributed or undistributed. So now let's look at our rules and see if we are violating any of those rules. So this rule, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. All right. Do we have anything distributed in the conclusion? Yep. Kings is distributed in the conclusion. Is it distributed in the premise? Yep. So check, we pass rule 3. Rule 4, the middle term must be distributed at least once. All right. what was our middle term? Our middle term we said was good things. Uh-oh, it's not distributed. So we have an invalid conclusion because it violates Rule 4. We do not have a middle term that's distributed at least once. We are violating Rule 4. Okay, here is the second syllogism. All right, so let's go through and do the same thing we've done on all the others. You should be getting pretty good at identifying major and minor terms by now. So let's go through and do that. What is our major term? It's going to be plants, which we see there and there. I'm going to write it down here now because that's the way it is on your quiz. So our major term is plants because it was the predicate of our conclusion. Our minor term is the subject of our conclusion. And this time they actually put the word things in there, so that helps. So our minor term is living things. And of course, it's here except for they didn't put in the implied word things, which should be there. So that is our minor term. And then our middle term is going to be what is left, which is animals. And a quick check, animals does mean animals. Are not playing any equivocation tricks on you. So let's check our rules here. Should have them kind of memorized by now. Rule number 1, 3 and only 3 terms. Yep, we have 1, 2, and 3. So rule number 1, yes. Rule number 2, I think I just reversed that, didn't I? Nope, middle term must not occur in the conclusion. Guess I don't have it completely memorized. Okay, does the middle term occur in the conclusion? Nope, it does not. So check rule number 2. All right, so now we start on rules 3 and 4. Now we look at whether they're distributed or undistributed. So let's go through and do that before we examine the rules. I'm going to make my little chart over here because it kind of helps. So I have premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Okay, let's look at each of these. Plants. Is the word plants up here in this premise distributed or undistributed? Is it referring to everything in this set of plants? If this is my circle of plants, well, it actually is, even though it says no, it actually is distributed. How do I know that? Because it is talking about pick every single plant in this subset of plants and examine it. Every single one in here is not the same as an animal. So actually, yes, that is distributed. We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's look at let's look at animals. All animals. Well, that makes it pretty easy there too, right? All always means it's distributed. So down here, animals in premise 2 is distributed. Let's come back and look at animals here. No plants are animals. So if this is my circle of animals, what they're saying is that inside here is a circle of no plants. This is plants, but I'm saying none of these, not a single one in here, is the same as animals. Actually, the correct way to draw it would be out like this, right? If this is the set of all animals or plants, nothing in here overlaps with animals. So in this case, is the word animals distributed or not? It actually is, because I have to look at every single animal in this set before I can tell myself that not a single one in here is the same as a single one over there. So in this case, animals is distributed in this first premise. Animals in premise number 1, right here, this is distributed. I'll put it up here. And we said this one was distributed also, right? Okay, so what about living things right here? Let's draw that out and look at that. So if this is my set of living things, all animals are living things, so that means in here is my set of all animals, and they are inside the set of living things. But is it the same as every living thing? Is there a living thing that is not an animal? Well, sure. Out here I would have, say, a plant, right? It's a living thing, it is not an animal. So is this case of living things here distributed or undistributed? It's actually undistributed. Okay. What about right here? No living things. Well, in order for me to be able to say no living things, I have to examine every single thing in this subset of living things. I have to come to this set of living things and look at every single one, and not a single one of them are equal to plants, is what it's saying here. So this is indeed distributed. I'm having to look at every single one. The no applies to everything in this entire set. So this is indeed distributed. So living things in the conclusion is distributed. The last one I haven't talked about here is plants. No living things are plants. Once again, I'm going to have to look at the subset of everything. Whoops, I'm starting to write animals. The subset of everything here called plants. I have to look at every single one in this whole subset before I can make the conclusion that not a single one in here is the same thing as a living thing. So is this distributed or undistributed? It's actually distributed because I have to examine every one. So plants in the conclusion is distributed. Okay? Now you don't have to make this diagram. You could write them above like this. I just made the diagram because on the quiz there's not much space here and it gets kind of hard to write these things in here unless you write really tiny. So I just wrote it out like this. Alright, so now I have determined whether all my terms and every case of my terms are distributed and undistributed. Let's compare them against Rule 3 and Rule 4. Rule 3 says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. So let's go see, do I have any terms distributed in the conclusion? Here's my conclusion. Is anything distributed? Yep. Actually, plants and living things are both distributed in the conclusion. Plants and living things. So it must be distributed in the premise. Let's look at this one. It was distributed in the conclusion. Yep, it was distributed in the premise. So plants is okay. It follows the rule. Living things was distributed in the conclusion, but it was not distributed in the premise 2. So therefore it violates Rule 3 right here. So this particular syllogism is invalid because it violates Rule 3. Okay, here's our syllogism. Let's start by identifying our major and minor terms and our middle term and our premises. This would be our major term, right? I hope you're saying no. Why? Because living is not a noun, so it could not be a term. Is there something that's implied here? And I hope you're saying yes. Things is implied. Some flowers are living things. So also up here implied is things. Because again, my term can't be an adjective. Again, if I just have this sentence, some flowers are living. Living is a predicate adjective. All plants are living, predicate adjective. I need a noun. So the word things is implied. So this is my major term. Living things. Minor term. Pretty easy. Flowers. And that leaves me with my middle term. Oh yeah, I forgot my blue one doesn't work. Plants. No tricky thing. They're not doing any equivocation there. Plants are plants are plants. Okay, let's talk about whether they are distributed or undistributed. I wrote this a little bigger, so I'm going to try to just put my D's and my U's above that. Plants, are they distributed or undistributed? Well, you know, as soon as you say all, you know it's got to be distributed. You're referring to every plant that ever has been, ever will be, or is currently. So I can just go ahead and put a D there. Anytime I see a some in front of something, I know it just means some of them, not all of them. Therefore, it can't be distributed to every flower in a full set because it simply says some. So I know right off the bat, if I see a some, it's an undistributed. So I can go ahead and put a U next to both of these. All right, now let's talk about the second half of our sentences. Are living things. The predicates always where it gets a little bit trickier. Are we referring to, if I draw up my full set here of living things, am I referring to everything within this set? If I were to draw this premise, I actually have plants in here like this. So all plants are not all living things because I actually have out here cats, right? Cats are a living thing and they're not plants. So I know that living things here is undistributed. It does not apply in this case to everything within the full set of living things. Likewise, I have the same situation here. I'm just going to replace this with plants. And since cats are not plants, I'll go ahead and erase them from there. What do I have here? Some flowers. This is the set of all flowers. Some flowers are plants. That's what this sentence is saying. So am I referring to everything in the full set of plants? Nope. So I know that this term is undistributed. Last one I haven't labeled down here is the second case of living things. So if this is my set of all things that are living, and some flowers are living things, then they're drawing it like this. This is the set of all flowers. And some of them are the same as living things, not all of them. Therefore, this is not distributed to everything in the full set, so it's U again. All right, so let's apply our rules. Rule 4 says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, must be distributed in the premise. So which terms are distributed in the conclusion? Let's see. Neither of them. Well, that makes it easy. So I guess that means we are okay on Rule 3. Rule 4, middle term must be distributed at least once. Let's go check. What's my middle term? Plants must be distributed at least once, and it is. So I'm okay with Rule 1, 2. Wait, did we look at 1 and 2? We have 3 terms: living things, flowers, and plants. So we're good with Rule 1. Rule 2 was middle term must not occur in the conclusion, and it does not. I have my major and my minor. My middle term plants is not down here, and we already said we obey Rule 3 and Rule 4. So guess what? This one is valid. Yay! Okay, let's move on to, oh, that was the last one on quiz 12. I'm not going to do the true and false. You guys can do those yourself. And we'll move on now to quiz 13.